Diamond & Diamond, a law firm in Canada, launched a $500 million class action lawsuit against the makers of glyphosate because of the concerns of the members of that class action in terms of the impact on their health, particularly with respect to non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. In Canada, there are lawsuits that have been filed in BC, in Quebec, and Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. In the United States, 18,000 lawsuits have been filed against as a result of health concerns that people have had from exposure to glyphosate or its commercial product Roundup. The first of these was settled in California last year, where a jury found that a school groundskeeper with terminal non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, that was brought about as a result of his exposure in the course of his work as a school groundskeeper to glyphosate and its formulation in the products he was using. And the company appealed that, and he still won on appeal, Mr. Speaker. It's interesting when you look at the science of this. As a result of that legal case, there were hundreds of pages of information released in court that have now become known as the Monsanto Papers, that showed the troubling approach the company took to science and evidence concerning the toxicology of glyphosate and its formulated products, where they actively avoided pursuing studies which might show unwelcome results, where they hardly tested the real-world toxicity of the products, and they ghost-wrote studies of supposedly independent scientists. So the company itself and its employees ghost-wrote studies that went out under the name of supposedly independent scientists, so it appeared that there was no corporate bias in them. The documents also showed that Monsanto systematically attacked scientists whose research threatened their profits. And there's plenty of evidence, of course, out there in the scientific literature, though, as usual, and this has been the experience with pesticides of all kinds that start to show that they have serious negative consequences both to public health and to ecological health, that shows up over time after use, because so much, when they're registered, the testing is done by the company who's manufacturing the product and is intending to register it. So they're the ones who are providing the science to demonstrate its safety, and there is no compulsion to provide any negative impacts that their research may have uncovered. I think that's important for people to understand. There's no compulsion for the company registering a pesticide to reveal if their science, their research has found any negative consequences. That's not presented as part of the package to the regulators, and that's concerning and important for people to know. I appreciate the motion to hold some hearings here, because while our bill is focused specifically on spraying of glyphosate over crown forests, primarily out of concerns for its ecological impacts there are obviously, from all of these lawsuits being filed, growing concerns clearly about the health impacts of the users who are most exposed directly to glyphosate and its formulations, whether the school lawnskeeper or groundskeeper, as in the California case, or farmers, or their farm workers, landscapers, and so on. So it would be good to get a real handle on what's going on there through these hearings. But I don't believe we need to wait whatsoever to end its use over crown forests. There's a wealth of research that's out there now demonstrating this particular hazards, ecological hazards to glyphosate. Now, of course, to begin with, we know its purpose is after a clear cut, if that clear cut is planted into a plantation, the natural diversity that tries to restore itself because because nature sees the clear cut as a natural disaster, like a fire or a windstorm. That's how nature responds. There's been this huge catastrophic change, and it responds by as quickly as possible trying to grow back shrubs and tree species which are going to be able to grow quickly, hold the moisture in the soil, hold the soil in place, and create the conditions ultimately for the species which once were there to come back. But given the strength of that, and it's very strong, the forces of natural regeneration in New Brunswick's forests, our particular forests, are extremely strong, which is why we really don't need to plant trees almost at all. Most places not necessary because the regrowth is so strong naturally. But the practices being used on Crown lands and on the industrial lands are such that they have a real emphasis on replacing the natural forest, following a clear cut with plantations, and then having to kill off what naturally tries to grow back to heal that giant wound in the forest with glyphosate and its formulations. So to kill off those hardwood trees that are growing back and shrubs and so on. So that's obviously reducing diversity right there, just right off the bat. That whole practice of clear cutting, then substituting a plantation with one or a couple of species at the exclusion of all others that normally would be there, and then spraying it to prevent them from or kill them as they grow up. So you're reducing biological diversity on the spot with that practice. But it's greater than that in terms of the ecological impacts in our forests, if that's not enough. For example, glyphosate acts as a chelating agent, which means it binds molecules to metal ions, and in particular it binds macro and micronutrients essential for many plant processes in the forest and resistance to pathogens, so it makes them unavailable, impeding their uptake and availability, as well as the uptake and availability of nutrients to those plants. So really at the fundamental base of the food chain, interfering with the ability of plants to take up nutrients. And that's obviously a concern. Related to that is also the fact that this could potentially have an impact on the nitrogen fixation of the leguminous plants there. So those plants that actually take nitrogen out of the air and fix them into the soil, we don't fertilize our forests. It's done naturally, and that's through this process of nitrogen fixation. And plants take nitrogen out of the air, fix them in the ground, making the ground fertile. And so the research suggests there may be negative consequences for the ability to maintain the fertility of the soils, interrupting that nitrogen fixation by leguminous plants. So that's, and then a third factor here is by changing the availability of essential nutrients as well as metals that might be in the soil, the herbicide may also impact soil life. And there's studies, for example, Mr. Speaker, that have demonstrated right at the base of the food chain in the soil that it impacts negatively on earthworms. We know the importance in our gardens of earthworms to the soil and moving nutrients around, and it's based on research that has been done in the peer-reviewed scientific literature, which is what I'm looking at here. You see a diminution in the population of earthworms as a result of exposure to glyphosate and its formulations. So you can see right there, in the very basis of healthy forests, the soil, real concerns about it undermining the life in the soil, the ability to maintain fertility in the soil, and the ability to uptake those nutrients into the plants. Similarly, staying at sort of the base of the food chain of the ecological system, when we look at a runoff of glyphosate and its formulations into our watercourses, into our streams and brooks, research indicates that, first of all, it lasts much longer in water than was first assumed by the documentation originally presented to regulators by the company involved. but in particular, the base of the food chain, it has toxic effects to Daphnia, which, if you think about plankton, it's kind of like a freshwater plankton, maybe is one way to explain it. It's if you ever did high school biology, it's one of those things you looked at in a microscope, and you could look at Daphnia. So it's like a freshwater plankton. It sits at the base of the freshwater food chain, of which everything else plays an important role in supporting everything else in our freshwater food chains, in our brooks and our streams. So you can see this is a real concern right at the base of the food chain in our soils as well as our streams and rivers. Now, there was a good overview done of the literature back in 2016 on the use of glyphosate-based herbicides in Environmental Health, so another peer-reviewed journal. And they identified a number of issues that are quite important and raise concerns about the continued use of glyphosate, certainly over forests and perhaps in other applications as well. They point out that not only earthworms, but as I mentioned, other beneficial soil organisms are impacted, and then more, I guess, species that mean more to people for one reason or another, like fish and butterflies, are also at risk. Glyphosate can actually, after repeated applications, can accumulate in soils, which is, of course, more of an impact on the agricultural and landscaping side because of repeated use in the same place. But it's important to note that, as well as groundwater contamination, which it was alleged at the outset when it first was being used that it was not a concern, but it turns out it is becoming a concern, as are some of its breakdown products. So soil health and fertility remains a real concern when it's exposed to glyphosate. And I want to reiterate that, every time we've ended up having to ban or deregister a pesticide, an insecticide, or a herbicide, or a fungicide, it really has resulted from years of research and looking at its impacts in the field after years of use, because our system, the way it's set up, doesn't catch that up front. And unfortunately, that means in some cases a lot of damage is done ecologically and damage gets done to people's health. And so it's only after the fact, after damage is done, that pesticides of various sorts end up getting deregistered or banned. And this is a fundamental problem. And every time, I will say, Mr. Speaker, every time they are, the companies and governments often defending them will say that they were registered and essentially they're safe until proven guilty. But the onus is the wrong way around because of what's at stake in terms of the impact on people's health and on our ecological health. So, how much time? 15 minutes. Yeah. So there are many other important impacts here. But I want to say, with respect to health, the incidence of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma nearly doubled in the U.S. between 1975 and 2006, and that glyphosate-based herbicides are implicated in that heightened risk of developing non-Hodgkin's lymphoma among human populations exposed to glyphosate occupationally. And that really fundamentally is why I like the proposal for this these hearings, because I am very concerned about the occupational health impacts that may be there for landscapers and groundskeepers and farmers who are most directly exposed to it. But, Mr. Speaker, I do want to propose an amendment to the resolution, to the motion, which would strike out the resolution clause and substitute Be it therefore resolved that the Legislative Assembly urge the Government of New Brunswick to ban the spraying of glyphosate and other herbicides over our crown forests under our power lines.
Amendment moved by the member for Fredericton South, seconded by the member for Kent North, by striking out the resolution clause and substituting, be it therefore resolved that the Legislative Assembly urge the Government of New Brunswick to ban spraying of glyphosate and other herbicide over Crown Forest and under our power line.